All right, so Dr. Koyzis, thank you for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
Some of you were here yesterday, and he spoke on how socialism suppresses society. Today he will speak on how libertarianism suppresses liberty. And so we're really grateful to have Dr. Koyzis. He has served for many years as professor of political science at Redeemer University College. He also now serves with me at the St. George's Center for Biblical and Public Theology, where he's a fellow in political science. And we've had a developing friendship by phone and email, and this is the first time I've met him in person, so really grateful to have him on campus. And he'll speak to us for a few minutes, and then we will have some time to dialogue with him. So, Dr. Koyzis, we'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce, and I'm happy to be here. This I have envisioned this as being fairly informal. I will make a few remarks, and then I hope to open it up to further discussion. And I don't think we can really understand libertarianism unless we understand liberalism, because libertarianism is really a subset of the larger category of liberalism. And liberalism is a very old political philosophy going back at least to the 17th century, to Thomas Hobbes, although there are antecedents in the ancient world amongst the Epicureans who were their ideas were very similar to those disseminated by Hobbes. As a matter of fact, I would imagine that Hobbes probably read the Epicureans, and maybe that he took some of his ideas from them. But suffice it to say that liberty or freedom is attractive to virtually everybody. You know, we want to be able to do as we think best. I don't want to say as we please to begin with, but to do as we think best. And so a whole political philosophy has grown up around that desire. But of course, we recognize your average toddler will not recognize this yet, that we can't do whatever we please, that there's the necessity of cooperation. So we need to, we're limited by the existence of other people, So whether I might want to swing my arm around, but it's limited by Bruce Ashford's nose here. If I start getting in his way, then that's going to be problematic at the very least. And that's the central dilemma, perhaps, of humanity and liberty. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in the 18th century, expressed the dilemma this way: man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. And as a matter of fact, I set that to music as well, using one of Rousseau's own tunes. Okay. So he's a musician. Maybe I'll send that to you at some point. But let me first say that liberalism. When I speak of liberalism, I'm not using it not immediately in the way that is usually used in American and increasingly Canadian political rhetoric. So we say that Hillary Clinton is a liberal, and the president of the United States. I think it would be a bit of a stretch to call him a conservative, but maybe,
George Bush.
Let's say George. Maybe I think the first George Bush, whom I had a great deal of respect for, and it might be that he would fit in that category much better. But as a matter of fact, the whole political landscape in the United States is characterized by liberalism in some fashion. So if you read the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson was very much influenced by the 17th century English philosopher John Locke. And almost, if I were marking the Declaration of Independence, I'd nail him on plagiarism charges, because he took so much out of John Locke. Life, liberty, and property in John Locke becomes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the final draft of the Declaration of Independence. And of course, it had to go through a committee. I think it started out as life, liberty, and property, but once the committee got to it, it became the pursuit of happiness. So in that respect, everything in the United States is encompassed in this liberal framework. So the current extreme polarization that we see right now, it hasn't always been like that, but on Capitol Hill and in Washington, D.C., and the various state capitals, it's not so much that it's liberalism versus something else, but it's two political parties that are contesting over who is the proper custodian of the liberal tradition. And as we all know, intramural disputes or disputes within families can be far more contentious and far more vicious than disputes between people who are merely friends who have fallen out of favor. Friends tend to go their separate ways if they fall out of sympathy with each other. In families, they're stuck with each other, and so it can be a lot more contentious. That's what's happening in the United States right now, and it all has to do with who has the proper custody of the liberal tradition. Is it the Republicans or is it the Democrats? It used to be that the parties were much more diverse than they are now. So the Democrats had a conservative southern wing that was still active in the early 1980s when Ronald Reagan became presidency. He was able to put something together like a governing coalition. I'm going to use some of the expression that's more appropriate to a Westminster constitutional democracy like Canada, using conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats. Conservative Democrats almost don't exist anymore. Progressive Republicans like the late Senator Charles Percy, representing my home state of Illinois, or somebody like the late Mark Hatfield, who was one of my heroes when I was a young man, and I was privileged to hear him speak in the mid-1970s in Minnesota. Those don't exist anymore. So the parties have become much more polarized than they were before. But suffice it to say, when I'm speaking about liberalism or libertarianism, libertarianism is simply one school within this larger liberal framework. Now, that said, have all of you read Political Visions and Illusions?
Yes.
Okay, can I assume that you know that you've read Chapter 2 about liberalism and know about the 5 stages of liberalism? Not necessarily. Okay.
So you want to do a?
Yeah. I'll run through it. These 5 stages of liberalism. This is something that I came up with as I was finishing the book. I recognized that liberalism, as it existed in the 20th century, was not the same as liberalism as it has existed in the 18th century. But I thought that I was working with only 2. So there was early liberalism, late liberalism. And then at the end of, as I was finishing the book in December of 2000, it struck me that liberalism needs to be understood in terms of more than simply 2 stages. And it was at this point that I came up with 5 stages. So the first stage I called the Hobbesian Commonwealth. And in the Hobbesian Commonwealth, basically the sovereign has all of the power, all of the political power. And whatever the sovereign says goes. This is the only way, Thomas Hobbes believed, to put an end to the war of all against all, which was what the state of nature was, this pre-political state that supposedly human beings were in before they formed civil commonwealths. The only real check on the sovereign's power, the only thing that would prevent him becoming tyrannical, is the practical consideration that if he drives people too hard, they'll rise up against him and unseat him from his throne. Now, Locke comes along later in the 17th century. Hobbes lived a very long time, from 1588, the year of the Spanish Armada, up until 1679. So a very extraordinarily long life for that period of time. Locke lived somewhat later. His life overlapped with that of Hobbes. Locke lived somewhat later. He was born in, I believe it was 1632, and he died in 1704, after the turn of the 18th century. And Locke was what one might call a moderate Hobbesian. He was a Christian of some sort, conventionally pious, and he took all of Hobbes's categories: the state of nature, the social contract that brings political society into existence, but he couldn't quite bring himself to take all of the logical implications of Hobbes's categories to the same extent that Hobbes would. So he did not want to be left with an all-powerful sovereign. So Locke is kind of Hobbes with weak knees, if you will. So he believes in something called the night watchman state, and that's the second stage in the development of liberalism. Now we have a strictly limited state that is established by individuals, sovereign individuals, who are not exactly in a war of all against all. They generally respect each other's property, but not everybody does. But the trouble with the state of nature is that there are certain inconveniencies, as Locke put it in 17th century English, that make the state of nature a somewhat precarious state. If you have to defend your property against everybody who tries to attack it, then it could become a kind of war of all against all, but not necessarily. So all that is needed is for individuals to give up only so much power as is necessary to put an end to these inconveniences. So Locke has a state that will be strictly limited. It basically carries, as the Apostle Paul put it, the power of the sword, and that's pretty much it. It's not going to provide a huge number of services. It's not going to try to regulate the economy. It's not going to do very much at all. But the night watchman stands guard at the city gates to, and if something is about to happen, if there's a threat, then he'll call people up, call up the military, and they'll come in to defend the city. The trouble with the night watchman state, as it developed then in the 18th century, which was a favorite of the classical liberals at that time, Thomas Jefferson, 1776 saw the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It has a much longer name than that. He was a Scottish moral philosopher. And basically the idea was that out of the seeming chaos of individual self-seeking, an invisible hand would reach in and create order out of this chaos of self-seeking. And we now know that as laissez-faire economics, laissez-faire capitalism. Sometimes it's called neoliberalism. And that was the going thing for a while. And then the Industrial Revolution comes. First, the second half of the 18th century in England, in the United States, especially in the northern part of the United States, beginning in the 1840s, and following the building of the railways and factories and so forth, didn't seem to work. Laissez-faire didn't seem to work very well, because as it turned out that as people were starting to pour into the towns from the country, the forces of the market suppressed wages. If you had relatively large numbers of people coming into the cities from the countryside, there are legal reasons why this happened in England and Scotland, but in the United States, people wanted jobs, so they began to move away from the farms into the cities. Then what happened is that you had abuses in the factories. You had people working for maybe pennies a day, maybe for 16 hours a day. Hardly able to sleep, not having any kind of social life. Everybody in the family would be working in the factories, including the husband and the wife and the children. And so it was a kind of an abusive environment. Also, at that point, because you had corporations that were becoming larger and squeezing out smaller businesses from the economy, it meant that now you had monopolistic trade practices, the setting of prices. So at the turn of the 20th century, you had people like Teddy Roosevelt coming onto the scene, a Republican, and of course the Republicans started with Abraham Lincoln, the anti-slavery movement, and so forth, and they were nationalists. They were political nationalists. They were economic nationalists as well at that time. And so Teddy Roosevelt comes along, and he becomes president purely by accident after the assassination of William McKinley just over the border from where we live in Buffalo, New York, during the World's Fair in Buffalo. And Teddy Roosevelt comes to the White House, and he is bent on breaking up these large trusts to try to restore competition to the marketplace once again. So now we move into the third stage, known as what I have called the regulatory state. Each one of these stages after the night watchman state sees an incremental expansion in the extent of the state's power. So now the state is not going to simply stand back and watch this game being played out there, simply setting ground rules. Now it has to intervene and check the power of these large trusts. So in 1890, you had 1914, you had the Sherman and Clayton Antitrust Acts. Standard Oil was broken up in 1911. 1984 saw the breakup in the United States, not in Canada, but of the Bell system as well, and all these baby bells that have existed for the last 30 years. And that's key to the regulatory state. So now we have the state that's going to regulate economic activity, recognizing that laissez-faire did not work. But the regulatory state did not prevent 1929. After this tremendous expansion of the economy, the greatest expansion in the 1920s, after the end of the Great War, the greatest expansion that had ever occurred in human history, it all collapsed for similar reasons that the economy collapsed in 2008. It was a bubble. The similar reason for what happened in 1720 when the South Sea bubble collapsed and led to the king losing his power in England, and basically after that point you have Robert Walpole becoming the first prime minister. So the Westminster system that we have in Canada is an accident due to an economic collapse that occurred in 1720. So purely by accident. So what happens? 1929, the Depression comes in. And Franklin Roosevelt then wins the election of 1932. In England, you have an economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes that starts to theorize, come up with theories as to how to even out the business cycle. The late 19th century, from the end of the Civil War, 1865, up until the turn of the 20th century, was a pretty bad time for most people in America. A huge depression in the 1870s, a somewhat minor one in the 1880s, but then a huge depression again in the 1890s. The reason why the World's Columbian Exposition was held in Chicago a year after the celebration of Columbus's discovery of the Americas was because of this depression. And the so-called Panic of 1893. People were really quite miserable. The reason the passenger pigeon became extinct when it filled the skies in the 19th century is because in the 1870s, people were hungry. And they were easy to kill. And people ate them because they had to. Otherwise, they would have starved to death in the 1870s. No welfare state to cushion the blow. Couldn't apply for social assistance or unemployment insurance. Nothing even approximating that. So then, in the 1930s, comes the fourth stage in the development of liberalism, what I call the equal opportunity state. So at that point, mere regulation is not enough. We have the beginning of aid to families of dependent children, 1935. Social Security, same year, started under Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. My mother was raised by a single mother, my mother and her sister in the 1930s, and this mother's allowance was very important to keeping families going during that dark time in American history. And basically Franklin Roosevelt had put together a coalition of Southern Democrats, and of course we may have difficulty remembering this now, but the solid South was solidly Democratic. Republican could never even hope to win an election anywhere in the South. It was a one-party system similar to Mexico, similar to the province of Alberta in Canada, which has basically been a series of one-party systems since 1905. And then around 1960, something else starts to happen. The decline of the industrial economy. The railways start to decline as well. We used to take the train to visit my grandmother from Chicago to Ann Arbor, leaving from the old LaSalle Street station, which you can see in Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest. Some of the action of that movie in 1959 takes place on a train. New York Central used to leave LaSalle Street station in Chicago. It would take our family to, within 10 years, all that was gone. The Elgin National Watch Company, which used to produce about half of the pocket watches between about 1865 and 1965, closed around mid-1960s. The economy was changing. People began to be aware of the environment and environmental issues and so forth, racial unrest, the Vietnam War, and so forth. And what we now have then is the choice enhancement state. We find the rise of the sexual revolution, which began a lot earlier. In 1956, Margaret Sanger was interviewed on television. She was born in 1879. So a lot of the things that began with the sexual revolution started shortly after the turn of the 20th century, took fire in the 1920s, and then out of the trauma of the Depression, the Second World War, all of that pretty much went into dormancy, and it didn't reemerge until the 1960s. In the 1960s, a pretty comfortable era for most people. I'm a baby boomer. I grew up in a comfortable time, suburban Chicago, and we had the shopping malls and the suburban homes and everything, and our generation, I have to say, became spoilt. So if anybody talks negatively about millennials, well, I'm sorry, but the baby boomers started it first. And I'm a baby boomer. I was born smack dab in the middle of the baby boomer. And we wanted to have the right to choose everything. Everything the whole world would belong to us. Sexual freedom. We wanted to choose how we were going to use our genital organs, and we didn't want any kind of even social constraints being placed on that. Along with that came the right to abortion, the right even to change the legal definition of marriage, which has happened in this country. It happened somewhat earlier in 2005 in Canada as well, and it's gaining momentum in other countries, mostly in the West, admittedly. Elsewhere in the world, it's not nearly as powerful as it is here. But I call this the choice enhancement state. But so now we want to have as much freedom as we possibly can. Our current Prime Minister's father, the late Pierre Trudeau, famously said, 1969, he said, "The state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation." The state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. That sounds right. Okay, it sounds good. It sounds obvious. The police are not going to see what couples are doing in their bedrooms. It sounds right. But he really unleashed a kind of process that is still, the consequences are still being played out. So what happens now? Now we're in this fifth stage, the choice enhancement state. If somebody believes that the unborn have a right to be carried to full term, if somebody believes that marriage is a covenant relationship, a unique covenant relationship, not simply a contract that's revocable at the behest of the two partners, but if it's a contract that has an intrinsic nature to it, in intrinsic character to it, that human beings are not the author of, then what happens is that liberty which we thought we have cannot be allowed to exist anymore. So what this choice enhancement state means that there will be negative consequences of all these choices that are being made. And the state is now called upon to dilute or to negate the results of all of these choices that people are making. So, is there one form of family that should be protected, or should we, as this Barney song, Barney, the purple dinosaur that my daughter used to listen to when she was a toddler, and there's one of these songs that says a family is this, a family is that, and then all families are good, etc. And there was one that said that I don't know, Junior lives with his mother, but his father and mother live far away, but he loves them both every day, as that's the rhyme, and I found myself when I would listen to that, I was thinking, oh no, it's not taking into account the child. The child needs a father and a mother. And that's very important, and so it's, do we say, well, all families are equal? Well, not all types of families will have the same results in the lives of the children, not by any stretch. My parents have been married for more than 60 years, and I am very grateful that I grew up in an intact house. We lived in the same city all the time that I was growing up. So, and this is what the choice enhancement state, individuals are radically atomized. We are alone. And we are alone with our choices. We want to be able to choose whatever we want. And if the effects of those choices end up being negative, then rather than saying that's a bad choice, we want to discourage people from making these choices, what ends up happening is that people call on the state to negate the effects of the bad choices. So in each of these stages, from 2, 3, 4 to 5, we see the state getting slightly larger until finally we don't know what the limits could possibly be. Because if we want to choose, We want to have a choice in absolutely everything. From marital partners, I'm only 2 generations removed on my father's side from arranged marriage. And that's something which I don't think there are very many people now in North America that can claim that. But choice now in marriage, choice in virtually everything, careers, and that's seen as an unmitigated good. But it does mean the results of those choices, the impact of those choices, need to call on the state to set things right again. So I didn't put this in Chapter 2 of Political Visions and Illusions, but what I see, and if the book goes into a second edition, I've made that proposal, I'm hoping to hear from the publisher in the not-too-distant future, then it may be that what I will do is to take this into a 6th state, which will bring us back to the first. So because of all of this, people are radically atomized from each other. People have the right to choose whether they are going to be a man or a woman. That's one of the basic categories of humanity. If we're allowed to choose that, and we force people to use the pronoun that we want them to use for us, or we'll make up a pronoun, and people aren't going to do that. It means it's going to create more and more zones of conflict, which will need to be adjudicated by whom? The state. Exactly. And this is libertarianism, if you will. On the left, the so-called left, I'm not wild about the use of right and left, politically speaking, but on the left, it's a kind of lifestyle and sexual libertarianism. That has more or less taken over the Democratic Party at the present time. Democratic Party would not be recognized by the likes of FDR and Harry Truman, or by Adlai Stevenson, or even Lyndon Johnson, for that matter. The Republican Party has now run with a different side of that equation. Now they are running with the economic libertarianism, if you will. So for them, it seems to be all money. We want to be able to make as much money as we can. If it hurts other people, too bad. Both sides have lost a sense of the commons, a sense of the larger public good. I would go so far as to say that they've lost sight of public justice, both sides. There are a lot of people last year in the presidential election who held their noses and voted for what they thought was the lesser of the two evils, which we are forced to do by our electoral system. Works the same in Canada as well. Even though we have 3 political parties in Parliament, still only the Liberals and Conservatives have ever formed the government, and for the most part Canadians may not be really excited about any of the 3 parties, but they hold their noses and they'll vote for the one that they think will do the least harm. And oftentimes that's what politics is all about. I want to mention, I just pulled this, just before we started, I pulled this out of Bruce's library here. It was just in back here. Public libraries always tell you, don't reshelve the books, please, because if you put it in the wrong place, so I'll allow him to reshelve this. Desiring a better country. Douglas Farrow, one of our Canadian philosophers whom I thoroughly admire. He's Roman Catholic. He teaches at McGill University in Montreal. And he wrote an essay several years ago that I make use of in my second book, We Answer to Another, called The Audacity of the State. And the development of liberalism that I put forward in Chapter 2 of Political Visions and Illusions, he takes that. He takes that. It's not in quite the same terms that I put it, but he recognizes what's happening. So whether we're talking about lifestyle libertarianism or whether we're talking about economic libertarianism, what happens is that human beings are now seen as atomized individuals facing not the institutions of civil society, such as the school, the business enterprise, the labor union, maybe even a bowling league. Not very many bowling leagues anymore. There probably were in my grandparents' day. All of the things that nurtured solidarity amongst Americans, and that were celebrated by people such as Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s when he visited North America. All of those things are suffering because we have now adopted so thoroughly this brand of individualism that now all that's left, it seems, Robert Putnam is another person who he wrote a book called Bowling Alone, and this wonderful book that I use in my European politics classes called Making Democracy Work, about civic patterns in modern Italy. Brilliant, brilliant study. Basically, what happens is that liberalism of whatever variety tends to downplay the ties that bind, other than the political ties. So marriage no longer has a God-ordained nature, if you will. Now it is simply a private contract between two people. Doesn't matter the sex of persons. Maybe the next stage will be term marriages, maybe 5-year term marriages with sunset clause. Maybe that's what's the next grand frontier in the sexual revolution. So what we're seeing, libertarianism, what it will do eventually is to quash liberty. Because liberty does not simply thrive on my being able to do whatever I want, whatever I please. But genuine liberty thrives on my recognizing my obligations to the various communities that have shaped me. So my church community, my family. But I think I'm going to stop right here because it turns out that libertarianism cannot tolerate any principle that will conflict with John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which says basically we are free to do whatever we want as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. But in reality, there are no genuine communities that have ever operated according to that principle. It's a utopian principle. It's a utopian principle. So if you are a member of a church community, the church doesn't tell you, do what you want, just don't hurt anybody. You can't read the Bible and think that this is the way things go. That's not the way things work at all. So, the church has legitimate authority to discipline its members, and if they do not live up to what is expected in the Bible, what is expected in terms of the standards of the Bible, Christian morality, if you want to call it that, then the church has an obligation to step in. But if they do that, they are violating my freedom to live any way I like. Shouldn't I be able to simply affiliate with any church I want to and not have the community set standards for membership? You can take that pretty far. You can take that to labor unions, you can take it to businesses, you can take it to schools, you can take it to Southeastern Baptist. If you want to teach here, you have to be a Baptist. Is that discriminating against the Presbyterians and the Catholics and the Muslims? Is there something wrong with that? Are Presbyterians going to wreak any harm on you if they come here to teach? No, but every institution, every community has its own standards. But libertarianism, in whatever form, cannot tolerate that kind of communal freedom, communal religious freedom in particular.